Hello, and welcome to the Open Virtual Film Project. In this video, I'm going to be showing you the local fog object blueprint. The easiest way to access this blueprint is to open the Open Virtual Film Project plugin and go to the General Resources folder, which is the pink wrench. Inside of here is a volumetric fog objects folder. Inside of this folder is this blueprint OVFP local fog object. Drag and drop that into the scene, and you'll see I have a little bit of a fog effect going on right now. If you don't see the fog when you first drop this into your scene, you need an exponential height fog object in your scene. In place actors, if you search for exponential height fog, drag and drop it into the scene, and you need to scroll down to where it says volumetric fog and turn it on. You can use this tool without volumetric fog, and I'll show you that as I go through the various different settings. The first setting you're going to come across is the type of fog to be generated. This is a volumetric fog object that is set to spawn a single spherical volume of fog that has a lot of texture settings. The second one is volumetric spherical with multiple. In this case, instead of generating a single fog sphere, it's going to generate a bunch of them randomly over time. With both the single and the multi, I have a few different settings. So scrolling down, I have an extinction multiplier, which affects the density, very similar to the extinction multiplier in an exponential height fog. And I have the ability to add a texture map for its base color, change the brightness, contrast, desaturation, and tint. So if I wanted blue fog, I could get blue fog. And then I have the ability to change around the opacity texture with the amount of opacity that it generates, the contrast, and a second opacity texture that will overlay on top. For the two opacity textures, the first opacity texture has the ability to rotate, so I can set a rotation speed on it. You see that adds a little bit of motion to my fog effect. And the second opacity texture has the ability to pan. And if I swap the opacity textures around, so that opacity texture 1, which is the one that has the ability to rotate, is set to a white object, and opacity texture 2 is set to that texture. I can set opacity texture 2 to pan, which gives another bit of motion to the effect. If I combine two textures with each other and give one of them a rotation and one of them a pan, you'll see it gives this nice random variation look. And then the last of the general settings are the ability to change around the scales, the rotation, and the UV stretch of any of the objects, very similar to how the OVFP master materials work. The next of the looks is this volumetric fog rectangular cutoff. Again, it comes in a singular variant and a multiple variant. And this one allows you to set your fog to cut off at a particular height. So if I set it up to the multiple and look down this hallway, you'll see they're all cutting off at this particular height here. I can change around the settings on that particular height with this start fade and end fade out height. These values are in absolute coordinates, so at negative 200 centimeters right now is where it cuts off. And if I give it a little bit of a fade, turn this one down to 250 and the fade out height at negative 200, you'll see it gives this nice soft effect right at the top, which is all cutting off by a certain height. This is fantastic for a ground fog effect. For this variant of fog, there is a button that allows you to set the fog start and end inside of the current volume of fog. So if you were to drag this up into the sky, you'll notice that the fog disappears because it is above that fog cutoff height. But I can click the set start and end, and it'll automatically jump, create a hard line, and from there I can edit my start fade and end fade. The next of the volumetric fogs is this rectangular with camera cutoff to create sort of an underwater effect. Very similar to the rectangular single we were just working with. It's creating this sphere of fog, which has a cutoff at a particular height. However, if I go above a certain camera height, it'll jump out of existence. And by setting the cutoff height low and cutoff height high, I can be above a plane, so there was a surface of water going on right now. And when I dip below the surface of water, the fog jumps into effect. Again, very useful for being able to see down into some murky water, but the instant you go underneath the murky water, your camera view is occluded by some volumetric fog. The last of the volumetric fog objects requires some setup, so I'm going to grab this volumetric from mesh object, and then I need a skeletal mesh in my scene. So in the same folder, there's a cone mesh that is a skeletal mesh. I'm going to drop that out into the scene. Grab my local fog object, and where it says mesh actor, I'm going to select this cone. You see it wraps this cone in fog. Then if I hide my mesh, I have a nice cone shape of fog. This is very useful for doing things like waterfalls or beams of light coming out of a lighting instrument, if you spend the time to set it up correctly. And then with this mesh, since I don't want to see it in game mode, I can either set its visibility to 0, or if I still want to see it while I'm editing, I can turn on the actor hidden in game. So now when I hit the G key, that mesh shows up, but when I'm in the game view, it no longer shows up. While you're working with them, try to keep your mesh as low poly as you can. It will try to spawn one of these fog objects at every vertex in the mesh that you create. That's all for the volumetric fog objects. Volumetric fog objects are also replicated in non-volumetric versions. So I have single, multiple, rectangular cutoff, multiple, and non-volumetric mesh. All of these, if you scroll down into the opacity settings, have an opacity near object fade distance and opacity near object fade contrast. And what these do is set a fade out away from objects. So if I have this set to 500, there's a nice even gradation from the floor into the fog. However, if I set this to 0, there's a hard edge between where the fog hits the floor and the fog itself. Very useful for giving a little bit more realism to your fog effects that are non-volumetric. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching.